Professor Madden, welcome to WCGO Chicago, and thank you for making time for us.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'd be very interested in your thoughts in audio form on all that is going on today and the comparisons made with the Crusades on the on an apolitical look at what the Crusades really were.
The Crusades, we historians who devoted much of our lives to studying the Crusades are often somewhat saddened by the fact that so few people really know what the Crusades were, but they still feel as though they can talk about it with great confidence, much the same way the president did recently. The Crusades were many different things. I mean, they were wars in the simplest form. They were wars that were fought during the Middle Ages, in which the Pope called together the knights of Western Europe to go to the aid of Christians in the East. These were Christians who had been recently conquered by Muslim armies. Their lands and their property was taken from them. In many cases, their lives were taken from them. And also to deal with problems of attacks on Christian pilgrims in the Middle East, particularly in the Holy Land. And so the purpose of the Crusades, therefore, was to come to the rescue of these Christians there, because the Christian world was becoming very small. There wasn't a lot left of the Christian world besides Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire. So the Crusades were that call, and they were, in other words, they were a defensive mechanism. They were an attempt by what was left of Christendom to defend itself against the continued Muslim conquest that had already conquered about two-thirds of the old Christian world.
I don't want to go forward just yet, if that's okay with you, Professor Madden. Our guest, of course,
Sure.
Professor Thomas Madden. If you can just pull us back one more time and explain to us, who is this fellow Muhammad? How does he come onto the scene? And in what world does he find himself aggrandizing his message, or I guess evangelizing, or taking territory in the manner we see ISIS doing now? Can you tell us what that day is and what the Middle East looks like at that time?
During the time of Muhammad, the Arabs are not very powerful. They're primarily in Arabia. The great power, and we're talking about in the 6th and early 7th century, the great power is the Roman Empire, or what we call the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. That's the real giant power, them and the Persians. This is after
Rome. This is before the end of Rome, but it's after Rome has gotten so big that it sort of splits up into two parts, right?
That's
and
right.
then the other major power, I guess, are the is it okay to call them Persians?
Yeah, the Persians. And those are the two main empires in the region. Muhammad really is not that focused himself on things outside of Arabia, but he begins having these prophetic visions, and then he has followers in Mecca initially, and then eventually he's thrown out and goes to Medina. And then as the political leader of Medina, he and his faithful wage war on Mecca, and then finally in 630 they conquer Mecca, which means they pretty much conquer all of Arabia, and then the plan is to expand outside of that. However, Muhammad dies in 632, so he never lives to see that. But very shortly after his death, the Arab armies, come pouring out of Arabia and attack both the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And both.
When you say Arab armies, these Arab armies are now Muslims. Do they call themselves Musliman?
Yes.
Do they call themselves Muslim?
They're followers of Islam. Yes.
Is the Quran being written at this time, or is the Quran completed by this time?
The Quran is the compilation of all of the prophetic words in which Muhammad related, and so those were all placed on paper a little bit later.
So Muhammad is sort of like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together. He says, "This is what happened. These are my dreams. This is the word. This is this is Allah, and what His will is for His people." Is that correct?
Right. That's why he's called the prophet. Right.
Right. Okay.
And then subsequent to that, this came at a very good time for them because the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire had just finished a brutal war between the two of them that had completely exhausted both empires. And so when this fresh new armies came out of Arabia, it was not difficult for them to very quickly conquer the Christian Roman Empire. So within a decade, they had conquered the Holy Land, all of Egypt, Syria, much of North Africa, and they would eventually go on to conquer all of North Africa and even into Spain.
This is by maybe 650 or something like that.
Yeah, by 720, most of the that first flush of conquest is finished. And so these conquests this is all Christian territory, obviously, and so now there are new Muslim rulers in all of those areas.
How did they conquer? How did those first Muslim conquerors conquer? Did they come in and, like the Romans, or like, people, Herod gets a bad name, but at the same time, there was some degree of sense of peaceful coexistence in the so-called Pax Romana. It wasn't necessarily, you know so much more than I do. I'm a little intimidated. My understanding is that the Romans weren't all bad. Neither really were the Greeks. They'd come in and say, okay, well, we have this system of government. You can be what you want to be. Was it the same sort of scenario with the Muslim conquerors, or were they raping, murdering, demonizing, as we see with ISIS?
No, they're certainly not like ISIS. I mean, these were wars, so they were bloody. However, the Islamic law required that those who were what are called people of the book, in other words, Christians, in practice, Christians and Jews, that they were not to be forced into conversion, or were they to be persecuted, provided they were willing to live under Islamic law, under Sharia. Mm-hmm. If they refused to do that, then they could be persecuted. But as long as they were willing to live under Muslim rulership and under Sharia law, then they were not to be persecuted, and they could continue to worship freely the way that they did before. In practice, and also when the Muslims came into the region, there was a lot of discord between various Christian groups. And so that also weakened the Christian world when they arrived. So all of those were things that the Arabs were able to take advantage of when they arrived and conquered the region. But it was by no means a wholesale killing of the Christians. In fact, quite the contrary. When the Caliph entered into Jerusalem in 634, when he captured it, Umar, he specifically did not go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because he knew that by Islamic law, if he went into it, it would have to become a mosque. And so he built a mosque near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre instead, so that the Christians could keep the church that was most holy to them. So there was a fair amount of accommodation. Is that what is now
the Dome of the Rock is not far from the Holy Sepulchre? Is that what that is? Or no?
No, the Dome of the Rock was built later. That's on Temple Mount. Yeah.
Yeah, that's that big golden thing that we always see when we see a picture of Jerusalem. You see the big mosque, the dome, they call the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? Who is the Caliph? Is he like a mufti? Is he a great spiritual leader, like a rabbi or something?
Well, I mean, literally, Caliph means successor. So he's a successor of Muhammad. Muhammad was the ruler of the Islamic people, And so his successors are the rulers of the Islamic people, the Ummah, which is the kind of the nation of the Islamic people. And so each one of them was.
Is there a present caliph?
It depends who you ask. There's someone in ISIS who says that they are a caliph, but that, and in fact, that was the case very early on. In the first century of Islam, they already had splits as to who was the caliph and who was not. And there was a fair amount. None of the early caliphs died in their beds. They were all assassinated by various intrigue. So it was rather chaotic.
When we hear the word Crusades, what were they?
The Crusades, they were a response. They were always a response to Muslim attacks. So they were attempts to try to roll back these Muslim conquests. The First Crusade was called in 1095 by Pope Urban II, and it was undertaken by knights, wealthy lords, who had the means to be able to pay to do this. You had to pay for yourself to go on a crusade, and they were very, very expensive, obviously, to go away for years and to fight these wars on your own money. They did it, though, because they saw themselves defending their own world in much the same way we would see ourselves going off to strange lands to defend our own country. And you have to remember, in the Middle Ages, there were no nation states. People identified themselves by their faith, and therefore, because their faith was being attacked, because other Christians were being attacked simply because they were Christian, then it was much the same as the way we would feel if Americans were being attacked just for being American. And it was also a devotional practice too. These were men who made their life with the sword, and so they were aware that they were very sinful, and so the crusade was a way for them to do something good with the one thing that they knew how to do very well, which was fight wars. And so the First Crusade left about 1096, and the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople, which was Christian then, and then went into Asia Minor. They reconquered a number of territories away from the Turks that had recently conquered it from the Christians and gave it back to the Christians. And so it was very successful in that respect. They also reconquered the city of Antioch, which was one of the major cities of Christianity. In fact, that was, if you read the Acts of the Apostles, that's where Christians were first called Christians, in the city of Antioch. Mm-hmm. And then, having conquered Antioch, they then began marching south towards Jerusalem, and in 1099 they captured the city of Jerusalem, and there they set up a kingdom, kind of a European-style kingdom, which would last for almost 200 years as they expanded throughout the region. Ultimately, the kingdom of Jerusalem would be about what today is Israel and Lebanon and Syria. So it was a substantial kingdom at its peak.
Tell us about the Jews at this time. What were the Jews doing? What was their role? Were they living peaceably with, you have not used the word dhimmi, were they living peaceably with their Muslim conquerors and Christian neighbors? And how did they interact with this warring going on for territory at this time of the Crusades, Professor Madden?
Yes, I mean, dhimmi just means non-Muslims who are living under Muslim rule, and they have to pay the dhimmitude, which is a special tax because they're not Muslim, a head tax. There were Jews in Jerusalem who lived peacefully there. There were Jews in the major cities under Muslim rules who lived peacefully, and there were Jews in Western Europe as well. The ones in Germany did not fare very well during the First Crusade. There were renegades who were not really interested in joining the crusade, but they were interested in using the enthusiasm for it to attack Jews. And unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, frequently in Europe, anti-Semitism would flare up, and you would get these attacks on Jews, and this was one of them. a number of people who had no intention of going to the Holy Land went into the various cities along the Rhine in Germany and began just rounding up Jews and taking their things or killing them. This was forbidden by the church. In fact, it was usually the local bishops who would open up their palaces to try to protect the Jews to let them in. But these people were very determined. So
isn't that fascinating? I didn't know that. So all of these pogroms in the Middle Ages that sort of changed everything for the Jews were really conducted by the likes of the brown shirts of the 1930s and 40s. They were just ruffians, and you're telling me that that they were not condoned by the church or by the representatives of the Pope?
No, not at all. The church had for centuries forbidden Christians to have anything to do with persecution of Jews. In fact, there was a fairly elaborate theology that had been defined about the tolerance for Jews in Europe. So it was thoroughly condemned.
So this was another thing that made Martin Luther so radical, right? Because Martin Luther really was sort of an out anti-Semite, at least in his earlier writings. I've read a number of things he said about killing Jews and destroying them and sending them all to hell. As the first
I don't know.
Protestant.
I do know that. One of the only places in Europe that the Jews were not expelled from was Rome, where the Pope was. There, they were always welcomed and never persecuted. But all of the other kingdoms in Europe during the Middle Ages, at one time or another, expelled the Jews or persecuted them.
Sure. Well, back to the Crusades. How do we number them, and what happened during them, and in sort of painting them with a broad brush? And why might our present executive leaders be wrong when they say that the Crusades are just nimbly about Christians killing everybody?
Yeah, the Crusade, the First Crusade itself, was very successful, as I just said. There were a lot more Crusades after that. In fact, the Crusades would continue on for about the next 500 years. But none of them were as successful as the First Crusade. In fact, most of them were unsuccessful. And the basic reason is that the Islam in the Middle Ages was the superpower. All of the wealth and the power was with the Islamic empires. Europe was very disjointed, it was very weak, and it was not very well off. And so the Christian world was in a difficult situation, and the Crusades were an attempt to try to reverse that, or to at least defend the Christian world. But in most cases, in fact, in almost all cases, they failed to do so. I think in the macro level, what the Crusades did was, over many centuries of effort, they were able to slow the progress of Islam long enough to keep Europe alive, to leave this little remnant of Christianity alive long enough to the point where Europe suddenly transformed itself, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, and became really a global power in a way that the world had not seen before.
Our guest is Professor Thomas Madden, the very, very well-known and highly regarded professor of medieval and Renaissance studies, now at St. Louis University, historian, author, among other things, of The Concise History of the Crusades, which I highly recommend, but it is only from reading others' reviews, because I have not yet read it, but I can't wait. Professor Madden, when I hear the word crusade, I get a vision of a wealthy, noble knight who's finally made it, to a sort of a hilltop in Jerusalem with his squires, about to do noble battle against the heathen Muslim invader, and I guess I just sort of get this image from some sort of collection of tapestries or something I may have seen. Is that about right? Was it a ragtag bunch? Were they organized? How did they fight?
Yeah, they were not organized in the same way that modern armies are organized at all. They were all free agents. They all had taken the cross. They had made a vow to God to go on this enterprise, and they worked together occasionally. But there was no there was no one person who was in charge, and there was no chain of command, except within the various nobles. Each various noble had his own vassals who would follow him. But aside from that,
were they vicious killers, as our president would lead us to believe, who conquered land and had no mercy for the poor multicultural communities, which they mowed over with abandon?
No,
screaming Jesus.
No, I mean, they were there.
Their right-wing sensibilities, listening to talk radio.
No, they were as probably the greatest Crusade historian who's ever lived, Jonathan Riley Smith at Cambridge University. He's pointed out that Crusaders crusading was seen as an act of love. It was seen as an act of charity because it was the love of neighbor. You were going to defend the neighbor. When Christ was asked about who is my neighbor, he told the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Crusaders saw themselves in that same light, that they were doing as their God had asked them to do, that they were going to bind up the wounds of the person who had been attacked by the robbers, and they were going to give them back the things that had been taken from them. So that was a big component in what they were doing. And the other was, as the Crusades went on, at least in the Holy Land, it was also to defend the holy sites, to keep them so that they were safe, so that people could visit them, and so that was another component of it as well. However, by 1291, the entire Crusader state was gone. The Muslims had unified and completely destroyed it. And by the 14th century, Muslim empires were in Europe itself. So after that, the Crusades became really just desperate attempts to keep Europe safe from Muslim invasion, and that too they pretty much failed at. The Ottoman Empire ultimately conquered Greece, all of southeastern Europe, what's now Hungary, parts of Italy, and made it all the way to Vienna. So it was they slowed the progress of Islam, but they weren't by any means able to stop it.
Thank you, Professor Madden. Well, what a nice call. And did those feet. Hymn 157 in the Anglican hymn book. I am the only Jewish boy who happens to know that by heart. Raised in Anglican loyalist schools. Professor Thomas Madden, historian, author, and director, author of The Concise History of the Crusades. Thank you for joining us. I know how valuable your time is, and it means a lot to us to just sort of go through this history and learn. Fascinating. I learned so much. Thank you, Professor Thomas F. Madden. Professor Madden, thank you. This is 1590 WCGO, Chicago's New Talk.